In the tropical heat of early March 1943, somewhere on the dusty tarmac at Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, a tool clattered to the ground from hands slick with engine grease. Captain Paul Irvin Gunn stood motionless, staring at what he and his team had created. The aircraft sitting before him represented something fundamentally unauthorized, something that broke every rule in the military handbook, something his superiors had never officially sanctioned. Where the transparent bombardier's station should have been on this B-25 Mitchell, there now protruded 8 heavy machine guns, all pointed forward like the fingers of an accusing hand. This twin-engine medium bomber, originally engineered for dropping ordnance from thousands of feet up, had been transformed into something the designers never imagined. It was a vessel of destruction meant to hunt ships. It was an improvised weapon of commerce warfare. It was an illegal experiment that might either revolutionize the Pacific campaign or land Gunn in front of a military tribunal. Nobody at that moment, not Gunn nor anyone else watching, could have predicted that this unsanctioned modification, born from desperation and burning personal rage, would soon deliver the most catastrophic naval defeat Japan would experience in the entire Pacific theater. The mathematics that would eventually add up to Allied victory in the Southwest Pacific weren't being calculated in approved strategic documents flowing from Washington headquarters. Instead, they were being welded together in makeshift workshops and maintenance facilities by a 43-year-old nonconformist who had his own very personal reasons for fighting. The path that led to this pivotal moment had started unfolding 2 years prior, on December 8, 1941, Manila time zone. Paul Irvin Gunn, a man nobody yet called Pappy, watched from his position at Nichols Field as Japanese aircraft systematically obliterated American air power across the Philippines. As the civilian manager of the newly established Philippine Airlines, he commanded a modest fleet of 4 Beech-18 aircraft. Within mere hours, Major General Louis Brereton would commandeer those civilian planes and pin captain's bars on Gunn, formally bringing him into the Army Air Corps. What everyone assumed would be a temporary wartime commission would instead become a 3-year journey of innovation, vengeance, and technological transformation. Gunn had already lived 42 years, including 2 full decades as an enlisted man in the Navy, where he'd served as a chief petty officer and naval aviator before hanging up his uniform in December 1939. His aviation education had come during the Roaring Twenties, and he'd flown with the prestigious Top Hatters Fighter Squadron, imparting his knowledge to younger pilots at Pensacola Naval Air Station. His understanding of aircraft came not from engineering textbooks, but from 20 years of hands-on experience, fixing them, flying them, and occasionally walking away from crashes. But on that December morning when war erupted, technical knowledge counted for nothing against the immediate crisis facing him. Gunn's wife, Clara Louise, known universally as Polly, and their 4 children were trapped in Manila as Japanese forces tightened their grip around the city. His sons, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were teenagers, while his daughters Connie and Julie were still young. The comfortable expatriate lifestyle they'd enjoyed while Gunn managed the airline had evaporated like morning mist. During the chaotic weeks that followed, Gunn flew whatever missions were thrown at him, reconnaissance runs and transport flights across the crumbling Philippine defenses. He evaded enemy fighters in the sky, survived being shot down in the jungle and hiking out to safety, then immediately climbed back into another cockpit. During one particular mission, his actions earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross when he piloted an unarmed transport aircraft into Bataan, delivering desperately needed medical supplies to surrounded American forces, navigating through airspace crawling with Japanese fighters, using nothing but raw skill and sheer audacity. Yet despite all his efforts, he couldn't reach his family. Christmas Eve 1941 brought orders to evacuate key personnel to Australia. Gunn withdrew every dollar of his military pay, borrowed whatever money fellow officers would lend him, and made preparations to bring his family to safety. But the Japanese advance moved too quickly. His family couldn't reach the airfield in time. Gunn faced an impossible choice between abandoning them or refusing direct orders. He climbed into that aircraft and flew to Australia because orders were orders, because the war was larger than one man's family, because remaining meant certain death or capture for everyone. Within weeks, on January 20th, 1942, Polly and the children were rounded up by Japanese occupation forces and marched to the University of Santo Tomas, now converted into an internment camp for enemy civilians. Something fundamental changed inside Gunn when this news reached him. The man who continued fighting bore little resemblance to the person who had departed Manila. He'd left his wife and 4 children in the hands of an enemy with a documented reputation for brutality. Every single day they remained imprisoned was another day Gunn couldn't protect them, couldn't hold them, couldn't assure them everything would be fine. The only action available to him was ending the war as quickly as humanly possible. If he couldn't save his family through direct action, he could systematically destroy every ship, every aircraft, every supply line that sustained Japanese forces occupying the Philippines. This wasn't official military doctrine. This was revenge dressed up in the language of innovation. When Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Brisbane during late July 1942 to assume command of Allied air forces in the southwest Pacific area, he inherited what could only be described as a catastrophe. His predecessor had been relieved of command. Morale among the air crews had hit rock bottom. Equipment was inadequate for the missions being demanded. The Japanese maintained air superiority over New Guinea and were posing a direct threat to Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur, the theatre commander, had made his lack of confidence in air power abundantly clear to anyone within earshot. Kenney was 53 years old, a veteran fighter pilot from the First World War with 2 confirmed kills and a Silver Star pinned to his chest. He'd spent time teaching at the Air Corps Tactical School and had developed a reputation for thinking outside standard operational procedures. When MacArthur subjected him to an hour-long lecture about all the failures of Allied air power, Kenney listened politely and then made a single request. He wanted authority to send home anyone he deemed deadwood, anyone not pulling their weight. MacArthur, somewhat surprised by this specific ask, granted it. Within weeks, Kenney had completely reshuffled his command structure, promoting aggressive younger officers and establishing a forward headquarters in New Guinea to eliminate delays in decision-making. He appointed Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead as his forward commander, granting him authority to modify aircraft assignments based on weather and tactical situations, rather than waiting for approval from Brisbane. But shuffling personnel around accomplished nothing without effective weaponry. Allied bombing attempts from medium and high altitudes were proving catastrophically ineffective against Japanese naval vessels. High-altitude bombing gave ships ample time to maneuver out of harm's way. The vaunted B-17 flying fortresses were achieving hit rates below 1% against moving targets. Japanese convoys were resupplying their garrisons throughout New Guinea essentially unopposed. Allied ground forces were dying in the jungle, while fresh Japanese troops poured ashore from ships that bombers apparently couldn't touch. Kenney had been pondering this specific problem since 1928, back when he was an instructor at the tactical school. He'd theorized about skip bombing, the concept of releasing bombs at extremely low altitude so they'd bounce across the water surface like flat stones skipped across a pond, then slam into ship hulls below the waterline where armor plating was thinnest. The physics made sense. The practical execution was proving difficult. B-17S lacked sufficient forward-firing weapons. Approaching at masthead height meant flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, with nothing to suppress the gunners raking your aircraft. Then Kenney discovered Paul Gunn, and everything started changing. In August 1942, Kenney learned that someone in the 3rd Attack Group was modifying a 20 Havoc light bombers without any authorization whatsoever. The modifications were crude but demonstrably effective. Someone had ripped out the bombardier from the transparent nose section and installed 450 caliber machine guns in his place, all firing straight ahead. The concept was strafing Japanese positions at extremely low altitude, suppressing ground fire before releasing bombs. Kenny investigated and discovered Captain Paul Gunn working essentially alone, scavenging weapons from wrecked fighters and mounting them in attack aircraft through trial and error. Gunn had taught himself aircraft modification through pure hands-on experience. He possessed no formal engineering degree, but he understood aircraft structures, weight distribution, and weapons systems from 2 decades of practical work. Most commanding officers would have court-martialed Gunn for modifying military property without authorization. Kenny immediately assigned him to his personal staff as a special projects officer and handed him what seemed like an impossible assignment. Modify every A-20 in the theatre for low-altitude attack and do it immediately. Gunn worked 18-hour days, sometimes longer. He scrounged weapons from crashed aircraft scattered across the theatre, fabricated mounting brackets in workshops that were barely adequate, and personally test flew every modification to ensure it worked. He added 4 50-caliber machine guns to each A-20's nose, mounted additional guns along the fuselage, and installed bomb racks for parachute fragmentation bombs. The modified A-20S entered combat in September 1942, hitting a Japanese airfield at Buna. The results exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. The Straffer A-20S came screaming in at treetop level with guns blazing, suppressing anti-aircraft positions before releasing their ordnance. Japanese defenders, who were accustomed to high-altitude bombers they could see approaching for several minutes, had virtually no time to react. The attack destroyed dozens of aircraft sitting on the ground and demonstrated beyond doubt that low-level strafing could fundamentally change air warfare. Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to begin similar work on B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. The B-25 was significantly larger than the A-20, possessed longer range, carried more bombs, and could accommodate more weapons. If Gunn could transform the Mitchell into a gunship, it would become the most devastating anti-shipping weapon in the theatre. The B-25 Mitchell had been designed back in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber. It was a twin-engine aircraft spanning 67 feet 7 inches, powered by 2 Wright R2600 radial engines, each producing 1,700 horsepower. Standard armament consisted of 6 50-caliber machine guns positioned for defense plus 3,000 pounds of bombs. It carried a 5-man crew consisting of pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and gunner. The aircraft bore the name of General Billy Mitchell, the controversial air power advocate who'd been court-martialed back in 1925 for his outspoken criticisms. Approximately 9,890 B-25s would eventually roll off assembly lines at 2 North American aviation plants, one located in Inglewood, California, and another in Kansas City, Kansas. The B-25 had achieved fame in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25Bs on an audacious raid against Tokyo, launching from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The raid inflicted minimal physical damage, but provided an enormous psychological boost to Americans still reeling from Pearl Harbor. More importantly, it forced Japan to retain fighter aircraft for home defense, rather than sending them to frontline combat zones. But the B-25's primary mission remained medium-altitude bombing, a role where it was proving ineffective against maritime targets. Gunn looked at the B-25 and recognized potential nobody else saw. The aircraft's nose section was spacious enough to accommodate multiple heavy machine guns. The twin-engine configuration provided redundancy, since losing one engine wouldn't necessarily doom the aircraft. The sturdy construction could absorb significant punishment. Most importantly, the Mitchell possessed sufficient range to reach Japanese shipping lanes that the shorter-range A-20 couldn't touch. During late 1942, Gunn began modifying B-25s in a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia. He was collaborating with Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation technical representative assigned to the theatre. Fox was supposedly there to ensure aircraft modifications followed factory specifications. Instead, he became Gunn's willing accomplice in what would develop into the most successful unauthorized aircraft modification program of the entire war. The initial challenge involved removing the bombardier and his transparent glass nose section. This eliminated weight and removed a vulnerable crew position. Gunn replaced the bombardier's station with a solid metal nose housing 4 50-caliber machine guns, mounted in packages, all firing forward. He added 2 additional 50-caliber guns in cheek blisters on either side of the forward fuselage, positioned just below and behind the cockpit. These package guns extended slightly beyond the propeller arc, allowing them to fire without bullets passing through the propeller disc. They were fixed in position, firing straight ahead, adding to the pilot's concentrated firepower. Then Gunn made a radical decision. The B-25 featured a dorsal turret with twin 50-caliber guns mounted behind the cockpit. This turret could rotate to defend against attacks from above and behind. Gunn locked the turret facing forward, adding 2 more guns to the pilot's control. The co-pilot could now operate these weapons using a sight mounted in the cockpit, or the pilot could fire all weapons simultaneously using a master trigger. The modified B-25 now mounted 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, delivering approximately 180 pounds of projectiles every second. For comparison purposes, a single P-51 Mustang fighter carried 6 50-caliber guns. The modified B-25 concentrated the forward firepower of more than one fighter aircraft in a platform that also hauled 2,000 pounds of bombs. The modifications created substantial engineering challenges. Adding weight to the nose shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward, making it nose-heavy and difficult to control. Gunn compensated by repositioning equipment throughout the aircraft and ballasting the tail section. The enormous recoil from 8 guns firing simultaneously created structural stress. Gunn reinforced the nose section with additional bracing. The guns generated tremendous heat and smoke when fired. Gunn added ventilation systems and relocated ammunition storage to reduce fire hazard. Most critically, Gunn had to solve gun harmonization. The 8 guns needed to converge their fire at a specific point ahead of the aircraft, typically somewhere between 200 and 400 yards. If the guns weren't properly aligned, bullets would spray everywhere except the intended target. Gunn developed a ground testing procedure using targets positioned at measured distances, adjusting each gun mount until all 8 weapons converged precisely. He test-fired the guns personally, making minute adjustments, refusing to sign off on any aircraft until it met his exacting standards. The entire modification process consumed approximately 2 weeks per aircraft when crews worked around the clock. Gunn trained maintenance personnel to perform the work, establishing assembly line techniques. By December 1942, he'd modified sufficient B-25s to equip the 91st Bombardment Squadron. The squadron needed a commander who understood low-altitude attack and wasn't afraid to ignore conventional bombing doctrine. Kenny selected Major Ed Larner, a pilot who'd rocketed from first lieutenant to major in mere weeks due to his aggressive combat leadership. Larner had demonstrated exceptional skill in low-level missions and had earned Kenny's complete trust. Larner and Gunn developed the tactics that would transform naval warfare. The modified B-25s would approach Japanese ships at extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the water, flying at maximum speed of approximately 300 miles per hour. At this altitude and speed, they were nearly impossible for ship gunners to track. The closing speed was too fast for manual aiming, and the aircraft were already passed before gunners could adjust their aim. As the B-25s approached within striking distance, pilots would open fire with all 8 forward guns at approximately 1,000 yards, walking the fire into the target vessel. The stream of 50-caliber bullets would sweep across decks, killing or suppressing anti-aircraft gunners, destroying gun positions, shredding superstructures, creating chaos and terror. The purpose wasn't sinking the ship with gunfire alone, although the damage could be substantial. The purpose was silencing the ship's defensive weapons and creating absolute terror among the crew. Then came the bombs. At a range of approximately 200 to 400 yards, flying at minimum safe altitude, the pilot would release a bomb equipped with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. The bomb would leave the aircraft travelling at 300 miles per hour, strike the water, and skip across the surface like a stone. The bomb would bounce once, perhaps twice, then slam into the ship's side at or below the waterline. The delayed fuse prevented the bomb from detonating on impact. Instead, it would penetrate the hull, sink slightly beneath the surface, then detonate. The explosion occurred in the most vulnerable section of the ship, below the armour belt where hulls were thinnest. The blast was amplified by water's incompressibility, which transmitted shock waves with devastating efficiency. A single bomb exploding below the waterline could snap a ship's keel, rupture fuel tanks, flood engine rooms, cause catastrophic structural failure. By the time the bomb detonated, the B-25 was already beyond the target, climbing rapidly to avoid the blast and secondary explosions. The entire attack from first gunshots to bomb release consumed approximately 10 seconds. Skip bombing wasn't entirely novel. The British had experimented with the technique. Some American pilots had attempted it independently, but combining skip bombing with overwhelming forward firepower was Gunn's innovation. The Strafe nose transformed the bomber into its own fighter escort, suppressing defences before releasing ordnance. This combination would prove absolutely devastating. While Gunn was modifying aircraft, Allied intelligence was monitoring Japanese naval movements. Ultra Intercepts, the code-breaking operation that had cracked Japanese naval codes, provided detailed information about enemy planning. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, known by the acronym FRUMEL, was reading Japanese messages almost in real time. During late February 1943, FRUMEL intercepted messages indicating a major Japanese convoy was assembling at Rabaul on the island of New Britain. The convoy's destination was Lae on the northern coast of New Guinea. The cargo consisted of troops and supplies for Japanese forces fighting Allied advances in Papua. The intelligence was remarkably specific. 8 transport ships would carry approximately 6,900 troops from the 51st Division. 8 destroyers would provide escort. The convoy would depart Rabaul at midnight on February 28, 1943, and arrive at Lae approximately 3 days later. This represented Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea. If the convoy succeeded, Japanese forces would be significantly strengthened, potentially halting Allied advances. If the convoy failed, Japan would lose thousands of experienced troops and likely never attempt another major reinforcement by sea. General Kenny recognized an opportunity to test his modified aircraft and new tactics against the most important target since Pearl Harbor. He assembled every available aircraft in the theater for a coordinated attack. The strike force would include B-17 Flying Fortresses bombing from medium altitude, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters strafing at low level, P-38 Lightning fighters providing air cover, and modified B-25 strafers executing skip bombing attacks. It would be the largest coordinated air operation in the Southwest Pacific to date. Kenny personally briefed squadron commanders on February 28th. The orders were explicit and brutal. Find the convoy, attack without mercy, give no quarter, sink every ship. This wasn't a raid. This was annihilation. At midnight on February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy departed Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded from the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy consisted of 8 cargo transports: Kyokusei Maru, Kembu Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima, Ayo Maru, Taime Maru, Shinai Maru, and Oigawa Maru. 8 destroyers provided escort: Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo. Approximately 100 Japanese Zero fighters would fly air cover during the voyage. The convoy represented the strongest force Japan had assembled for a resupply mission. Kimura expected to lose ships. Every previous convoy to New Guinea had suffered losses, but Japanese commanders believed enough ships would survive to deliver the troops. They were catastrophically wrong. The convoy was spotted that afternoon by a B-24 Liberator on patrol. The crew radioed the position, course, and composition. Kenny's command immediately launched reconnaissance aircraft to maintain contact. Weather initially favored the Japanese. 2 tropical storms moved through the area, providing cloud cover and reducing visibility. Allied aircraft maintained contact but couldn't attack effectively through the storms. The convoy made reasonable progress, moving at 7 knots, approximately 8 miles per hour. The slow speed was dictated by the heavily loaded transports. The destroyers could have achieved 20 knots or more, but they had to match the convoy's pace. By nightfall on March 1st, the Japanese had covered approximately 90 miles. They were roughly halfway to Leh. The weather was deteriorating, which Kimura welcomed. Poor weather meant fewer Allied aircraft, but the storms also meant rough seas that pounded the transports, and troops below decks suffered terribly from seasickness in crowded holds. On the morning of March 2nd, 1943, the weather improved slightly. Allied reconnaissance aircraft regained visual contact. At approximately 10 in the morning, 29 B-17 flying fortresses attacked from 5,000 feet. The high-altitude bombing was predictably ineffective. The B-17s claimed hits, but Japanese records indicate minimal damage. 1 transport may have been slightly damaged. The attack served one purpose, though. It forced the convoy to alter course repeatedly, slowing progress toward Leh. Throughout March 2nd, additional B-17 strikes continued. The flying fortresses dropped dozens of bombs from various altitudes. Ships maneuvered frantically. Japanese fighters engaged the bombers. Several B-17s sustained damage. 3 Japanese fighters were shot down. But no ships sank. The high-altitude attacks were harassing the convoy, not stopping it. As night fell on March 2nd, Kenny knew the critical attack would come the following morning. The modified B-25s were ready. Major Lana had briefed his pilots repeatedly. They'd rehearsed the attack profile against a wrecked ship, practicing combined formations of B-17, B-25, P-38, and bow fighters. Every pilot understood the mission. The skip bombing technique had been practiced. The strafer guns had been harmonized. The ordnance had been loaded. The point of no return was approaching. At dawn on March 3rd, 1943, weather conditions were perfect for an air attack. Clear skies, excellent visibility, calm seas. Rear Admiral Kimura must have felt dread settling into his bones. His convoy was approximately 30 miles from Leh, close enough that land-based anti-aircraft guns could provide some support, but still horribly vulnerable to air attack. The Allied strike force assembled at Cape Ward Hunt on the northern coast of Papua. Approximately 90 Allied aircraft converged on the Japanese convoy. B-17 flying fortresses, modified B-25 strafers, Royal Australian Air Force bowfighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters for escort. Multiple waves would attack from different directions throughout the day. The attack commenced at approximately 10 in the morning. B-17AS struck first from medium altitude, diverting attention and forcing ships to maneuver. Then the low-altitude aircraft arrived. Bowfighters came screaming in first, strafing with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, suppressing anti-aircraft fire. The destroyers opened up with everything they possessed, but the closing speed was simply too fast. Then the modified B-25 strafers arrived and the slaughter began. Modified B-25 strafers participated in multiple attack waves throughout the morning. One pilot selected the transport Kyokusei Maru as his target and pushed the nose down to 50 feet above the water. At 1,000 yards, he opened fire. 8 50-caliber machine guns, 6,800 rounds per minute combined rate of fire, 180 pounds of projectiles every second, ripped into the transport. Tracers showed exactly where the bullets were going. The fire walked from the bow toward the superstructure, shredding everything in its path. Sailors were cut down where they stood. Anti-aircraft guns were blown apart. The bridge disintegrated under the impacts. Metal fragments flew in every direction. Then he released his bombs. Two 500-pound general-purpose bombs with delayed fuses dropped away. They struck the water 200 yards from the ship, skipped once, and slammed into the hull just below the waterline amidships. The pilot pulled up hard and banked away. Behind him, the bombs detonated. Two massive underwater explosions ripped the bottom out of Kyokusei Maru. The transport lurched violently. Water poured into the engine room and holds. The ship began settling immediately, listing heavily to port. It would sink within 15 minutes. Other modified B-25s followed in successive waves. Each selected a target. Each executed the same devastating attack profile. Guns blazing, bombs skipping, ships exploding. The transport Kembu Maru took multiple hits. At least 3 B-25s attacked it in sequence. The combined gunfire killed most of the crew above decks. 4 bombs struck below the waterline. The ship broke in half and sank in less than 10 minutes. Teiyo Maru was strafed so heavily that fires erupted across the superstructure. 2 bombs opened the hull like a can opener. The transport went down with nearly 1,000 troops still aboard. Nojima attempted to maneuver but was too slow and cumbersome. A B-25 strafer raked it from stern to bow, then planted 2 bombs into the engine room. The ship lost power and began taking on water catastrophically. It would sink later in the day. The bow fighters and remaining B-25s attacked the destroyers with equal ferocity. The destroyer Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, was hit by strafing fire that killed almost everyone on the bridge, including Kimura himself, who was wounded. A bomb struck near the stern, starting a magazine fire. Secondary explosions blew the stern section completely off. The destroyer sank. Tokitsukaze took direct bomb hits that ignited fuel tanks. The destroyer became a floating inferno and sank within the hour. Arashio collided with the transport Nojima while desperately maneuvering and suffered heavy damage. The destroyer was abandoned and sank. Throughout the attack, Japanese Zero fighters tried desperately to protect the convoy, but the P-38 Lightnings engaged them at high altitude while the B-25s operated at masthead height where fighters couldn't safely attack without hitting their own ships. The coordination was flawless. The attack lasted approximately 40 minutes. When the Allied aircraft withdrew to rearm and refuel, the scene was apocalyptic. 4 transports were sinking or already sunk. 3 destroyers were gone. The remaining ships were scattered, some damaged, all in complete chaos. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors were floundering in the water. Bodies floated among the wreckage. Oil slicks burned across the surface. That afternoon, Allied aircraft returned for additional strikes. Modified B-25s found the surviving ships limping desperately toward Leh. The attacks were methodical and merciless. Each ship was targeted individually. The strafer B-25s came in low, guns blazing, bombs skipping across the water. More transports sank. The destroyer Asashio, already damaged from earlier attacks, took more bombs and went under. By nightfall on March 3rd, all 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers had been sunk. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead or drowning. Another 2,700 would be rescued by the 4 surviving destroyers and by submarines dispatched from Rabaul. Only about 1,200 troops would eventually reach Leh, most without weapons or equipment. Of the 6,900 troops originally embarked, more than 5,700 were casualties. The convoy had been utterly annihilated. Allied losses were remarkably light. 1 B-17 Flying Fortress was shot down. 3 P-38 fighters were lost in combat. 13 aircrew were killed. Compared to the Japanese losses, it was barely a skirmish. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it became known, represented a fundamental turning point in the Pacific War. It demonstrated conclusively that land-based aircraft could destroy a heavily escorted naval convoy. It proved the devastating effectiveness of skip bombing when combined with overwhelming forward firepower. It validated every modification Gunn had made to the B-25. Most importantly, it convinced Japan that resupplying garrisons by sea in the Southwest Pacific was no longer feasible. Never again would Japan attempt a major convoy to New Guinea. Japanese forces there would slowly starve and wither as supplies dwindled to nothing. General MacArthur issued a communiqué claiming 22 ships sunk, including 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers, with over 12,000 troops killed. The actual numbers were lower, but still devastating. The exaggerations were typical wartime propaganda. What mattered was the strategic impact. Kenny had proven his concepts worked. Skip bombing was viable. Modified bombers were lethally effective. Low-altitude attacks could succeed despite heavy defences. Paul Gunn, watching from Australia as reports filtered in, must have felt grim satisfaction. His modifications had destroyed a Japanese convoy. His aircraft had killed thousands of enemy troops. But his family was still imprisoned in Santo Tomas, and the war was far from finished. The success of the Bismarck Sea battle led to immediate expansion of the modification program. Kenny ordered all available B-25s in the theatre converted to Strafer configuration. Gunn worked even harder, training additional crews, refining techniques, increasing production rates. By mid-1943, most B-25s in the Southwest Pacific had been modified. North American Aviation, the manufacturer, took notice. Company representatives visited Gunn's workshops, examined the modifications, and requested detailed specifications. The company wanted to incorporate Gunn's innovations into factory production. Gunn was promoted to major and sent back to the United States to work with North American Aviation at their Inglewood and Kansas City plants. He spent several months in 1943 and early 1944 working with engineers to design factory-produced Strafer versions of the B-25. The result was the B-25G, which mounted a 75mm cannon in the nose along with 450 caliber machine guns. 405 B-25s were built. The 75mm cannon fired a 14.7-pound shell that could penetrate ship armour or destroy bunkers. But the cannon was difficult to load, required a crew member in the nose, and had a painfully slow rate of fire. Gunn personally tested the B-25G in combat, leading a raid with the 3rd Attack Group against a Japanese destroyer. He hit the fire control system with the 75mm cannon, disabling the destroyer's ability to coordinate its guns. The ship was then sunk by conventional bombs. Gunn insisted publicly that he'd sunk the destroyer with the cannon, but privately admitted it was the bombs that finished the job. The B-25H followed the G model into production. 1,000 B-25Hs were built with the 75mm cannon and 1450 caliber machine guns arranged in various positions. The H model relocated the dorsal turret forward and eliminated the co-pilot position to save weight, with the navigator handling cannon loading duties. The massive firepower came at a cost, though. The B-25H was nose-heavy, cumbersome, and difficult to control. Wright Field, the Army Air Forces Development Center, sent Gunn a message stating the modification was dangerous and aircraft should be grounded until the center of gravity issue was resolved. Legend claims Gunn replied, "Put center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight." The story may be apocryphal, but it captured Gunn's attitude perfectly. Technical perfection mattered less than combat efficiency. The pilots learned to compensate for the handling issues. The final production variant, the B-25J, reverted to a conventional bombardier nose on some aircraft while retaining the strafer nose on others. 43,118 B-25Js were built, making it the most numerous variant. Some B-25Js were equipped with 8 forward-firing guns in the nose, 4 guns in cheek blisters, 2 guns in the dorsal turret, and additional guns in waist positions. Total armament could reach 1850 caliber machine guns, making it the most heavily armed bomber of World War II. The firepower was unnecessary in most situations, but it intimidated enemy forces psychologically. Japanese troops learned to fear the distinctive sound of Mitchell engines. That roar meant death was incoming. Throughout 1943 and 1944, modified B-25s devastated Japanese targets across the Pacific. In August 1943, B-25 strafers attacked Japanese airfields at Wewak in New Guinea. The raids destroyed 174 aircraft on the ground, breaking the back of Japanese air power in the region. The Wewak raids were possible because Gunn had solved another problem: range. B-25s had sufficient range for most missions, but Wewak was at the absolute limit. Gunn developed a technique using auxiliary fuel tanks carried in the bomb bay. Once the fuel was consumed, the tanks were jettisoned through an open hole in the floor. The system was crude, with fuel fumes permeating the fuselage and a breeze blowing through the aircraft, but it extended range by several hundred miles. The Wewak raids ended Japanese air superiority over New Guinea and allowed Allied ground forces to advance with minimal air opposition. In November 1943, B-25 strafers attacked Rabaul Harbour in one of the war's most spectacular raids. Major Raymond Jock Hennebrey led 38 B-25s against shipping in the heavily defended harbour. The attack occurred at masthead height with P-38s providing top cover and phosphorus bombs creating smoke screens. Of 38 vessels in the harbour, 30 received direct hits. 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and numerous transports and support ships were sunk or damaged. The raid paralysed Rabaul as a forward base and demonstrated that even the strongest Japanese positions were vulnerable to modified B-25s. In the Philippines campaign of 1944, B-25 strafers provided close air support for ground forces, destroyed Japanese supply lines, and attacked shipping throughout the archipelago. The aircraft became known as the Bat out of Hell because attacks came so fast and low that defenders had no time to react. Gunn's modified B-25s weren't the only weapons winning the Pacific War, but they were among the most effective. They destroyed hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft on the ground, and killed tens of thousands of enemy troops. They enabled MacArthur's island-hopping strategy by isolating Japanese garrisons from resupply. They gave Allied forces air superiority that made amphibious landings possible. Gunn's personal war continued throughout this period. His family remained imprisoned at Santo Tomas. Letters occasionally reached him through the Red Cross, but communication was sporadic and heavily censored. He knew conditions in the camp were deteriorating. Japanese guards became harsher as the war turned against them. Food became scarce. Disease spread. Gunn could do nothing except fight harder, hoping each mission brought the war's end closer. In late 1944, American forces invaded Leyte in the Philippines. Gunn was there, still flying combat missions at age 45, still searching for ways to destroy the enemy more efficiently. During one night in late 1944, Japanese bombers attacked Tacloban airfield on Leyte. Gunn was on the ground when white phosphorus bombs exploded nearby. Fragments tore into his shoulder, causing massive damage. The wound was severe, rendering his right arm essentially useless and causing excruciating pain. He was evacuated to Australia for treatment and would spend months in recovery. The wound ended Gunn's combat flying, but his war was almost finished anyway. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division, forming a flying column, liberated Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. The cavalry arrived just as Japanese guards were preparing to execute the camp's leadership. In the chaos of Manila's brutal street fighting, American soldiers freed over 4,000 internees. Among them were Polly Gunn and her 4 children. They had survived 3 years and 14 days of internment. The family was emaciated, traumatized, but alive. General MacArthur personally visited the camp shortly after liberation and met the Gunn family. He arranged for them to be flown to Australia to reunite with Pappy Gunn. The reunion occurred weeks after liberation. The man who had departed Manila on Christmas Eve 1941 finally held his family again. Polly had kept the children together through impossible circumstances. The boys, now young men, had survived the separation of male and female quarters. The girls had endured years of deprivation. They were together again, but they were fundamentally different people than they had been. The war had changed them all irrevocably. Gunn remained in the Army Air Force after recovering from his wounds. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and continued working on aircraft modifications and tactical development, though no longer flying combat missions. He retired from military service on June 30, 1948, as a full colonel, medically retired due to his injuries. His decorations included the Distinguished Flying Cross with one oak leaf cluster indicating a second award, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, 9 Purple Hearts, and numerous unit citations and campaign ribbons. 9 Purple Hearts represented 9 separate occasions when he was wounded or injured in combat. Gunn returned to the Philippines and re-established Philippine Airlines. The country was rebuilding from years of occupation and the destruction of liberation. Gunn helped restore air transportation, reconnecting islands that had been isolated. He was still flying, still taking risks, still pushing limits. On October 11, 1957, 7 days before his 58th birthday, Gunn was flying a charter flight when his aircraft encountered a severe storm. The plane crashed. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn died doing what he'd done for nearly 40 years, flying. He was buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station Pensacola, where he had once been an instructor. His legacy lived on in multiple forms. The B-25 strafer modifications he pioneered remained standard throughout the war. Approximately 9,890 B-25 Mitchells were built, and thousands were configured as strafers based on Gunn's designs. The skip bombing technique he helped perfect destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships and contributed significantly to Allied victory in the Pacific. Gunn demonstrated that innovation could emerge from anywhere, even from modifications made by a grieving father in a maintenance hangar. The official military bureaucracy wanted to fight World War II with existing weapons and approved tactics. Gunn showed that desperate circumstances required desperate innovations. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a case study in military academies worldwide. The combination of intelligence, coordination, new weapons, and new tactics achieved complete victory at minimal cost. It demonstrated what air power could accomplish against naval forces when properly employed. 8 transports destroyed. 4 destroyers sunk. Over 5,000 casualties inflicted, all for the loss of 4 Allied aircraft. The mathematics were simple and brutal. You couldn't survive in an environment where the enemy controlled the air. Every ship sunk in the Bismarck Sea represented dozens of missions that would never be flown, hundreds of troops who would never fight, thousands of rounds of ammunition that would never be fired. Destroying supplies before they reached the battlefield was the most efficient form of warfare. The modified B-25 became the weapon system that made this possible. It could range hundreds of miles to find ships, suppress their defenses with overwhelming firepower, destroy them with skip bombing attacks, and return to base for another mission. One B-25 strafer could accomplish what previously required coordinated attacks by multiple aircraft types. Japan learned the lesson too late. After the Bismarck Sea disaster, Japanese commanders understood they could no longer move large convoys in daylight within range of Allied air bases. They switched to nighttime movements, used submarines for critical supplies, and increasingly relied on barge traffic that could hide in coastal waters during daylight hours. These measures reduced but didn't eliminate losses. B-25 strafers hunted barges with the same efficiency they hunted ships. Night-flying B-25s equipped with radar found convoys in darkness. There was no safe time, no safe method, no safe place for Japanese logistics in the Southwest Pacific. The stranglehold tightened month by month until Japanese garrisons were effectively isolated. In New Guinea, in the Philippines, throughout the Pacific Islands, Japanese troops fought on with dwindling supplies and no hope of reinforcement. They were brave, tenacious, and ultimately doomed. Air superiority achieved by weapons like the modified B-25 made their courage irrelevant. By 1945, the modified B-25 had become the standard anti-shipping weapon in the Pacific theater. The aircraft evolved with the B-25 G, H, and J variants incorporating increasingly heavy armament. But the basic concept remained Gunn's original innovation, a medium bomber converted into a flying gun platform that could suppress defences and deliver devastating attacks at minimum altitude. When the war ended in August 1945, modified B-25s were still flying combat missions. They were among the aircraft that escorted the Japanese surrender delegation from Japan to Manila in mid-August. It was fitting that the aircraft that had done so much to defeat Japan would witness its surrender. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese historians confirmed the significance of Gunn's innovations. Japanese naval officers stated that after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, they knew they couldn't safely operate in waters within range of Allied air bases. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. Convoy commanders knew that low-flying bombers could appear without warning and destroy entire formations before defences could respond. Modified B-25s had created a new type of warfare where medium bombers hunted ships with the efficiency of submarines and the firepower of cruisers. The implications extended far beyond the Pacific War. Post-war air forces worldwide studied the lessons of skip bombing and forward-firing armament. The concept of the gunship, an aircraft designed primarily for gun attack rather than bombing, became standard in many air forces. The AC-47, AC-119, and AC-130 gunships used in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts were conceptual descendants of Gunn's modified B-25s. Of the 9,890 B-25s built during World War II, over 100 survive today, most in the United States. Many are maintained in flying condition, appearing at air shows where crowds marvel at their size, sound, and history. The distinctive roar of Wright R2600 engines is unforgettable. The sight of a B-25 banking low over an airfield, as they did over Japanese ships, reminds observers of what these aircraft accomplished. Several flying B-25s are configured as strafers with forward-firing guns in the nose. When these guns are fired during demonstrations using blank ammunition, the sound is overwhelming. The muzzle blast is visible. The aircraft shudders from the recoil. Watching a B-25 strafer demonstration gives viewers a glimpse of what Japanese sailors experienced in the final seconds before their ships were destroyed. Museums worldwide display B-25s in various configurations. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, has multiple examples. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where Gunn once instructed, displays a B-25. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum preserves the history. Each aircraft tells the story of innovation, desperation, and victory. In 1959, General George Kenney published a biography titled The Saga of Pappy Gunn. Kenney, by then retired, wanted to ensure Gunn's contributions weren't forgotten. The book detailed Gunn's modifications, his combat missions, and his personal war to free his family. Kenney wrote that Gunn was one of the most important individuals in the Pacific War, a man whose unauthorized actions had saved thousands of Allied lives and shortened the war. Nathaniel Gunn, Pappy's youngest son, also wrote about his father's story. His books provided the family perspective, describing life in Santo Tomas and the long wait for liberation. The Gunn family story became an example of war's human cost and the strength required to endure. In 1975, the United States Air Force honored Gunn posthumously by naming a training facility after him. The recognition was overdue but heartfelt. Gunn had never sought glory. He'd sought effectiveness. The story of how one engineer's unauthorized modifications created a devastating weapon system remains relevant. Gunn refused to accept his family's imprisonment as inevitable. He refused to accept that existing weapons were adequate. He refused to accept regulations that prevented innovation. That refusal, combined with technical skill and Kenny's support, produced modifications that changed warfare. The B-25 strafer destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships, killed thousands of enemy troops, and contributed significantly to Allied victory in the Pacific. Innovation can emerge from unexpected sources and succeed through unorthodox methods. The modified B-25 wasn't the single weapon that won World War II. That victory required contributions from millions of people using thousands of weapons over 4 years of global conflict. But the modified B-25 achieved effects disproportionate to its numbers. It was born in a maintenance hangar from desperation. It flew into combat at masthead height with guns blazing and bombs skipping across water to slam into hulls and explode below the waterline. It destroyed Japanese hopes of resupplying their forces. It shortened the war. It saved Allied lives. And it freed one family from 3 years of imprisonment, which was the point all along.